Hey, it's Tay, and today I'm going to show you how to make StrataCut animations. Like the title implies, this video will walk you through how to build and animate your first time loaf. If you're not sure what StrataCut animation is, check out this video from my channel and come back here when you're ready to loaf. The texture we'll be building today is called the Makume Gain pattern, which creates these cool, undulating colors. It's actually an oven-baked clay technique that's normally used to make jewelry, but when I found it, I naturally had to see if you can animate it. And you can. To build this time loaf, you'll need plastilina clay. At least 3 colors, but more only makes it trippier, so go crazy. Use contrasting colors for a more vivid and flashing pattern. I like to use Van Aken clay. It's affordable, ships quickly, and holds up super well. A pasta machine. Yes, like for making my mom's ravioli. Technically, a roller works and is certainly the cheaper option, but this is one of those things I urge you to splurge on to make your life a million times easier. I use the Marcato Atlas 150, but there are a bunch of affordable options online. A blade. I use the Lucy rigid clay blade, but any blade will work, even your parents' expensive kitchen knives. And an assortment of random stabby objects. I'll explain later. To animate this time loaf, you'll need a camera. A phone works fine, but be aware you'll have to touch the screen to snap your photos, and that can cause unwanted movement in your animation if you're not careful. A tripod to keep your camera still. A stop motion software. I use DragonFrame, which is the industry standard for stop motion animation. It's pricey, but if you can afford it, it's completely worth the money. If you're using a phone though, there are a few stop motion apps, free and paid. A way to trigger your camera to snap a photo remotely. DragonFrame comes with a controller for this, but if you're taking the pictures straight to your camera to animate later on your computer, there are shutter release remotes that are perfect for this online. A strong, sharp blade. Believe it or not, a clay blade is not actually best for this. Clay blades have flex to them, even the rigid ones, and the surface tension of the clay will prevent you from getting straight slices. Think of one of these, like a bread knife but without the serrated edge. But technically any sharp knife that's not too wide will work. Obviously, it's going to get covered in oily clay, so maybe don't use your parents' expensive kitchen knives for this. They're already mad at you for failing social studies. Links for everything I just listed are in the description. All right, we're ready to build the time loaf. Clay time! I've chosen to use 6 colors because I want to get extra wacky with it. Just make sure you have roughly the same amount of clay for each color. First, we roll the colors out into sheets. I like to use the thickest setting on my pasta machine, which is 0. If you're hand rolling, aim for the thickness to be around 1/8 inch for every sheet. Lay out a sheet and cut out a square toward the edge. It's best to use something as a guide for this. In fact, a square cookie cutter would be ideal, but I don't have one, so I'm just using this paper cutout as my guide. Cut out as many squares as possible from the sheets of the first color using the guide. And when you don't have space for any more, mix the scraps back together and roll it out into more sheets, repeating the steps we just went through. We'll follow these same steps for each color, stacking the squares as we go. You should end up with roughly the same amount of squares in each stack, but don't worry if it's not exact. To make the next step easier though, order the stacks so each one contrasts the last in color. Take a square from the first stack and lay it in front of you. Now, place a square from the second stack and line it up with the first one. Keep stacking your squares, alternating between colors each time. I'm starting with the first 4 colors and slowly adding in the other 2 so there's a change of color partway into the animation. It should look something like this. A good length for the loaf is around 5 inches. Now it's time for the stabby tools. I told you I'd explain later. With the random assortment of stabbies you've collected, stab through the time loaf all the way to the bottom. Alternate tools, placement, and angles to create a randomized variety of holes. Use a blade to make slices all the way through the loaf, but keep the pieces together. This part looks crazy, but something magical happens when you impale the loaf, so let your inner demons free and give it your best stabs. Anyway, now that you've massacred your time loaf, start pressing it from all sides with your hands. Use a decent amount of pressure and flip it around as you go to apply the same amount of presses to all sides. Do this over and over for a good 5 minutes or so. This fills in the holes and cuts, resulting in the trippy goodness we want in our animation. After wrapping the loaf in a sheet of white clay, it's on to animating. This process will involve making a slice, taking a picture, making a slice, taking a picture, and so on. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, slicing and animating StrataCut has a learning curve of its own, and there are a few things to keep in mind. I want to give you a few crucial tips so you can nail this on your first try. Take your time slicing the time loaf. Learn to love the process and practice micro-adjusting your hand placement and slicing angle to get straighter and more consistent slices. The straighter and more consistent the slices, the smoother your animation will turn out. I shoot for 1/8 inch slices, but that's really difficult to do by hand, so just try your best. Clean your blade after every slice. Any clay buildup on the blade will smear the face of the loaf. I love these Up and Up fragrance-free baby wipes from Target. They clean off the clay well, don't leave any residue or fragrance on your hands, and they come in huge packs for pretty cheap. I always keep a few packs on hand. Don't slice in a hot or a cold room. Temperature has a huge impact on plastilina clay, and if the room is too hot, your clay will be soft and result in smeared slices. If the room is too cold, it will be much more difficult to slice through your loaf. The best temperature to slice your loaf is room temperature, or just above it. This also goes for if you were just handling the clay. It'll be warmer than it should be, so let it cool down to room temperature or throw it in the freezer for a couple minutes before making your first slice. Your loaf will want to move as you're making slices. An easy way to prevent this is to use clay to build a support on the back of the loaf. This will also double as a support to hold up the last slice as we're animating, otherwise it would just fall over. Press the back support against the surface you're slicing it on to hold the loaf in place. I sometimes press little bits of clay on the sides of the loaf to prevent it from moving from side to side as well. As you slice your loaf, the face of the loaf will get further from the camera, resulting in the focus becoming blurry. So you have 3 options to keep the camera focus on the face of the loaf throughout the animation. Move the loaf toward the camera. With this method, you move the time loaf toward the camera after every slice to maintain the distance between the loaf and the camera lens. There are a lot of creative ways to do this, but the easiest one is to build a conveyor belt out of popsicle sticks. This is a super cheap way to get smooth animations. Simply pull the conveyor belt forward after every frame is taken. Move the camera toward the loaf. This method involves touching the camera, which is usually a big no-no in stop motion, but at Taymations, we don't follow rules, so just touch it. The cheapest way to do this is similar to the popsicle stick conveyor belt, but you put it under the camera instead of the time loaf. This allows you to slide the camera forward in a straight line toward the loaf after every slice. They do also make these macro photography sliders, but these can be pretty pricey. Change the camera's focus. The third option is to change the camera's focus after every slice to land on the face of the loaf. This method can be pretty difficult, and again requires touching the camera, which can cause unwanted movements in your animation. Also, the loaf will get further away and smaller in frame as it goes, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on what you're going for. I'll be using the popsicle stick conveyor belt under the time loaf method. But whichever method you go with, just remember that keeping the camera's focus on the loaf is super important, and make it part of your flow as you animate in StrataCut. Now we've got our scene set up with lighting and set dressings. Snap a frame of the time loaf before making your first slice. Now make your first slice and take your time trying for a perfectly straight 1/8 inch slice. Make sure to slice all the way through the loaf so you don't pull it forward as you remove the slice from frame. Depending on what method you chose to keep focus, move the loaf forward, the camera toward the loaf, etc., and try to make the distance moved equal to the thickness of the slice. Continue this process until you've sliced all the way through the loaf, and you've created your first StrataCut animation. Now simply revel in its beauty and remind yourself of how talented and awesome you are. Seriously, I'm so proud of you. A bonus pro tip for you is to set up a second camera or phone and capture a time lapse of the animating process. I would love to see your first time loaf in action, so please tag me if you share yours. My social links are in the description. And feel free to ask me anything about this process in the comments. StrataCut is still such an obscure art form, but there's a small community of us, and we'd love it if you joined. Be sure to keep your eye out for more advanced tutorials from me. And remember to eat, sleep, animate.